In the last video, a line of ancestry is preserved genetically if genes are inherited. A lack of ancestry determines that descent has not preceded the ancestry that is observed, and the ancestry that is observed is the ancestry from which the organism has proceeded. This is to say that humans have only ever descended from humans, and animals have only ever descended from animals. 2b. The fallacy asserts species adapt to an environment over time, and that species that adapt to an environment become evolutionarily isolated, or adapted to their environment, in which no additional factors influence evolution or that progress has ceased or is falsely asserted as ongoing. These are the problems and fallacies of evolution. Evolution intends to be an argument of adaptation, and as a consequence, the result of its demise. Supposing the nature of evolution is asserted, determines that all species that descend from an ancestor as a result should otherwise be observable, or are supposed to be observable, as asserted as a consequence of descent. It is to say, every transitional species is subject to such conditions based on the assertion between its ancestor of origin and the species that it has transitioned from or into. Both must be observable if one precedes another, and as such determines all transitional species should be currently observable, and as populous as the population of species they have transitioned from, as they have proceeded from species currently observable. For the simple reason of adaptation, in which all transitional species are asserted to be preserved, transitional species, or the forms of species who have adapted, who no longer experience change, are, however, not observable. If this is argued, there should be no observable trace of evolution, and thus evolution is disquantified and false by the simple means of induction. To assert only that the highest forms of a species is observable is fallacy. From the basis of observation alone, evolution has not occurred because it did not occur. It is absolutely nonsense as the consequence that nothing is observable or related to a species that exists today, which outlines that species do not adapt nor evolve, because if they adapt, they would be observable continuously throughout all periods from the origin to the extent of origin. To revise an assertion is to only revise the dogma. Dogma is not a basis for what is real. As such, the asserted transitional species should be observable in the same manner as species that predate a transitional period, that has adapted, that is observable, but not observable because it evolved. It is fallacy as an assertion due to the fact no such species is observable. That is to say, nothing evolves. In summation, if species were preserved by adaptation to an environment, transitional species would be preserved as a consequence and as a result by adaptation to an environment. As stated earlier, a line of ancestry is preserved. This would require transitional species to be preserved by the very condition that has caused them, and their ability to adapt and remain evolutionarily isolated, which is not a matter of observation, but the realization no such event has ever occurred by the very assertion that the event did, and should then not be purported, but based on such conditions, is the very basis by which evolution is false. A lack of ancestry determines that descent has not preceded the species that are observed. To assert species that have adapted, that have descended from the same or original line of species, are asserted to be preserved by adaptation, but all transitional species are not preserved by adaptation, makes the conclusion obvious. Evolution is false. The adaptation is fallacy as well as evolution, or that adaptation is fallacy as well as evolution. To a higher degree, if anything had altogether affected all species that have transitioned from the same lines of species, all lines of species are affected simultaneously and never result. This is to say, if all transitional species become extinct, their extinction determines they never evolve. Subsequently, this would prevent progress, a result or consequence of all transitional species being affected. This evaluates that since no transitional species are observable, no transitional species have ever occurred, and there is no evolution from a species that is itself extinct or unobserved. The logic is simple. Ancestors cannot be preserved if ancestors are directly related to or as a cause for a transitional species, as whatever affects a transitional species prevents progress up to any purported point. At the point transitional species terminate, all outcomes terminate or are prevented from occurring. If all outcomes are prevented or terminated, a line of ancestry does not exist. This is to say, because apes exist, apes should solely exist in such circumstances, and the gap between apes and humans is the underlying problem without an observable transitional species. The gap between the ancestor of apes and the species that precedes the gaps between apes is also another problem. Considering all gaps exist across all species, apes would consequently never result. Therefore, the logic is simple. All species exist without an ancestor other than their same kind. Instead of using fossils as an argument, of which there are none, simple logical induction dictates evolution is altogether fallacious, just based on logical induction that species do not evolve, but have remained the same as they always have been. The consequence of the assertion brought to its highest extent is that instead of starting on the tree that Darwin purports at a particular point, no transitional species is observed from the earliest point in any line of ancestry or its predecessor, and determines that all is falsely asserted. All of these species altogether do not exist. To argue fossil evidence is to argue a line of descendancy as old as time. There should be nothing but a complete fossil record. It should not have to be difficult to look for, as all species from the beginning of time have died in all states. There is no fossil record. Human fossils predate ape fossils. Human fossils have been observed with the remains of dinosaur fossils, and as such, the entire notion of evolution is discredited and will remain false without evidence because it did not occur. All of the lines of the transitional species are unobservable. All lines from bacteria to vertebrates to falsely asserted Neanderthal to apes to humans to dogs to cats to bats to zebras to hippos to lions to dolphins to any and all mammals, which are not human ancestors. No line of descent is traced between any animal of its kind, and absolutely no ancestry is observed. Considering that the assertion adaptation is the system by which life and origin would be preserved in both living and non-living instances, a lack of evidence dictates that since no such evidence exists, and no such observations can be currently made on the premise that adaptation does preserve these instances, the fact no instances are observed dictate that adaptation never occurred as well as evolution not having occurred. To assert that species are observable because of their ancestry, or that they are an ancestor, would dictate that the ancestor responsible for a species is an ancestor in such the assertion that they should be observed. Having absolutely no trace of lineage one to the other, genetically or physically, evolution is a hollow false assertion. It should be obvious all species are not transitional forms, or species from which anything has transitioned. Regardless of induction, molecular biology has silenced the idea of Darwin's fallacy as false for good. Any genetic information that is inherited is preserved, regardless of what's observable physically. If genetic ancestry existed between any animal species in relation to human beings, as an origin responsible for human life, humans would not lack such a genetic ancestry. However, they do, and as a consequence, this is not a lack of ancestry as related to any sense of evolutionary biology, but the determination descent from a species has not occurred on planet Earth. You would imagine the dinosaur is enough of a kind of argument to cease the idea that a 31,000-pound reptile evolving into a 197-pound person on average, or a 9-ounce monkey, is a hallucination of the most absurd kind and would be the farthest biological step backwards. It should be noted that the unavailability of a system, or any unavailability that exists when a system determines evolution is false, as genetically speaking, the most basic unit of cellular life determines that on a molecular level, the unavailability that exists when a system like evolution is the lack by which the system can come into being, or the means that prevent its possibility. A basic cell cannot be cubed in any manner of variation outside of the order of operations that exist within the system. Put simply, the most basic base pairs of molecular life that would exist within the beginning, as asserted in evolution, determine 1. The unavailability in the system prevents progress, or the unavailability in the system to progress. 2. And that the arrangement of the most basic units of cellular life as any division of themselves, or any numbered arrangements, never become more complex or result in any dissimilarity, considering that base pairs are the actual units that themselves are being based to purport that variables exist within base pairs. It makes absolutely no sense. That would be like saying if I have one triangle and one square and one circle and one teacup, if I arrange them in a precise order, or depending on the ways in which I arrange them, they become a hand. The system's lack of complexity, or the system's quality or condition of being plain, physically reduced to a limited number of parts or pieces, elaborates evolution as a fairy tale. This is to say, an original lack of availability in a system, or the unavailability that exists within such a system, defines that such cannot even be defined as a system, and is in highly contrast to potential, as it lacks the potential means to progress, which is to say it lacks a means by which it can progress, or which progression is possible to occur. By lacking such, the system is indefinitely restricted, and such changes can never occur with any sort of system that is perpetually affected by an unavailability that exists within the system. A lack of potential determines the condition that evolution never occurred. A lack of potential progress completely disqualifies evolution as completely false. The unavailability of means outline evolution as false, within the asserted proportions, that such is not even possible. This is not an argument. This is logical induction based on fact, that evolution is false. The simple unavailability of a system's means is not a problem for evolution, but the very reason it is false. The lecture is going to continue in video 4 and cover the Gospels as fact. End video 3.